Folks haven't been reading the Bible.
The Islamic State of Iraq and Syria ISIS are fulfilling Bible prophecy. If you look at a map of the cities that ISIS has taken, you will see something very significant. The significance is found in Revelation chapter 9. Here is what Revelation says.
The sixth angel sounded, and I heard a voice from the four horns of the golden altar which is before God, saying to the sixth angel which had the trumpet, Loose the four angels which are bound in the great river Euphrates. And the four angels were loosed, which were prepared for an hour and a day and a month and a year, to slay the third part of men. And the number of the army of the horsemen were 200,000,000, and I heard the number of them. And thus I saw the horses in the vision, and them that sat on them, having breastplates of fire, and of jacinth and brimstone. And the heads of the horses were as the heads of lions, and out of their mouths issued fire and smoke and brimstone. By these three was the third part of men killed, by the fire, and by the smoke, and by the brimstone which issued out of their mouths.
Did you hear what he said? 4 angels bound at the Euphrates River will be released to kill 1/3 of mankind. This tells us that World War III will begin in the region of the Euphrates River. Take another look at the map. The river starts in Turkey and flows through Syria and then through Iraq. Half the cities that ISIS has taken are literally on the Euphrates River. And they have formed a caliphate, which is the first step to reviving their Islamic empire.
These are the main two reasons for him to change or to shift his policy from zero problems to zero friends.
Washington is not is really supporting the Sunni objectives, and they're using Turkey. They're not, even though they may pay lip service, I don't think they mind so much that Turkey has in fact moved into portions of Iraq on the one hand, and also that they're pressuring and into Syria. And I think it's part of the agenda. They have a twofold purpose. One is to try to have Turkey still look westward, but at the same time they're trying to balance off against this, what has in effect has become a Sunni-Shia war, and the outside powers are helping to fight it.
The terms Sunnis and Shiites get thrown around a lot when discussing Middle Eastern conflicts. And sometimes it's useful, but most of the time it feels like it's just shorthand for these people hate each other. But with over 1.5 billion Muslims in the world, there's no way they can all be involved in some Hatfields and McCoy-style blood feud. So what's really going on here? Well, first of all, not all Sunnis and Shiites are at war with each other. There are tons of places where they coexist peacefully, like the United Arab Emirates, or Dearborn, Michigan, for example. It's also worth noting that their religions aren't diametrically opposed. In fact, the Sunni-Shiite conflict isn't even really about religion, it's about power. Originally, Muslims were all one group, unified under the Prophet Muhammad. Then, in the year 632, Muhammad died, and Muslims split off into 2 separate groups. The Sunnis wanted Muhammad's successor to be chosen by his community of followers, while the Shiites wanted the leadership to stay within the Prophet's family. The Sunnis were in the majority, so they chose their new leader to be the Caliph, which is basically the head of state. The Shiites did not recognize this new leader, and instead, they chose Muhammad's son-in-law Ali as their new imam, which also basically means head of state. That was the main source of divide, and from there, things really only got worse. Early on, most of the Shiite imams met violent ends at the hands of the stronger Sunni caliphs, including Imam Ali's son, Hussein, whose beheading is still considered a major holiday for Shiite Muslims. Today, there are numerous Sunni and Shiite militant groups, terrorist organizations, and oppressive governments. Being Sunni or Shiite doesn't necessarily make you a member or even a supporter of those groups, but they're still divided up that way. In fact, every nation with Sunni-Shiite conflicts has large militant groups on both sides, and they all have a history of oppressing one another depending on who's currently in power. Iraq, for example, was run by an oppressive Shiite regime before Saddam, then an oppressive Sunni regime under Saddam, followed by an oppressive Shiite regime once again after Saddam left power. Now, the oppressive Sunni militant group ISIS is threatening to take over huge parts of the country. So you can see that the Sunni-Shiite conflicts are more about power, politics, and retribution than actual religion. And truthfully, the words Sunni and Shiite aren't even the best words to use when discussing Sunni-Shiite conflicts. They are way too general. If you're talking about militant jihadists or terrorist networks, but what you really mean is ISIS or Al-Qaeda, just say ISIS or Al-Qaeda. Otherwise, you're including billions of people who aren't even involved and most likely don't share the beliefs of those fringe organizations.
I cannot decide, and maybe you can help me out, who is using who more. The United States is using Turkey plainly, but it looks to me as if the Turkish government, the Erdogan government, is using the United States fully to its advantage.
Oh, absolutely. The United States agreed in order to get Turkey to agree to U.S. using the Incirlik Air Base, for example, to go in and start bombing in Syria. But what they bombed everything but ISIS targets. They bombed. They bombed the Kurds who were against ISIS. What does that tell you?
What is happening in Syria and Iraq is not just another war. It will grow to become World War III.
Because that's what a lot of people don't seem to realize. They don't seem to realize that, you know, we're already in World War III.
In the Bible, in 2 Thessalonians 2:11, in reference to the last days, it says that because people did not love the truth, God handed them over to a strong delusion that would cause them to believe a lie. Furthermore, the word strong in that verse is the Greek word energeia, which literally means something that affects everyone. We're also told in 2 Peter 3:8 that a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like a day. The delusion of the last days, therefore, and the resulting lie that nearly all people continue to believe, is something in which the citizens of the world, regardless of their beliefs or religion, or lack thereof, have been immersed in for several thousand years. You see, we live in a world that was turned upside down, and actually backwards, long, long ago, just like it says in Isaiah 29:16. As a fact, we have accepted that upside down and backwards way of living and believing is not only normal, but good. The truth, or what can also be called the true standard, has been exchanged for a lie or a false standard. You see, that's how the powers that be fool the world, and by doing so, make the people of the world fools. This is what is meant in Romans 1:22 when we're told that people who have confessed themselves as wise became fools. No matter who you are, listening to this audio or watching this video, you are no exception. But not to worry, because we're going to fix that. Of all the people I speak with, the individuals who are not only the most hostile to the truth and adversarial to the real standard are those who are religious-minded. And the worst bunch of people I've ever had to deal with in my life are Christians. Christians, as a fact, have used the image of Jesus, as well as their false ideal of faith, which requires absolutely nothing on their part, as crutches. And when you bring undeniable, verifiable evidence to them that their beliefs are false, even when it is directly from the Bible, void of any personal interpretation, they have no problem bludgeoning you with one or both of those crutches. But I want to be fair, and do not want to be hypocritical or embrace a double standard like so many Christians do today. Christians are not the only hostile ones.
Why are the Jewish people in Israel today? Is it random? Is it a coincidence? Or is it destiny? What's happening in Israel today is the culmination of Jewish history. For almost 4,000 years, the Jewish people have been living on faith. Faith in prophecies given thousands of years ago. Promises that seem irrational, promises that seem almost impossible. Every prophecy dependent on the next. If one isn't true, none of them are true. Every single one of them is coming to pass in our lifetime. Every single one of them.
This is the history of Israel and Palestine. Through the centuries, the land we now call Israel and Palestine changed hands many times as different groups of people battled for control of the area. Over time, the establishment of the Jewish, Christian, and Muslim religions made the land, especially the city of Jerusalem, a uniquely holy place. For about 1,000 years in the Middle Ages, the Arabs almost always held control of the area, and actually lived relatively peacefully with the Jews. In fact, it was the Christians, during their brief rule, who massacred and persecuted both the Jews and Muslims. At the turn of the 20th century, around 1900, the idea of statehood had firmly taken root around the world, and so, naturally, many Jews wanted a country of their own. But in the 2,000 years since the founding of Judaism, most Jews had left the Promised Land and spread throughout the world. But with the goal of creating their own country now achievable, large numbers of Jews started to come back and settle in Palestine. World War I brought the defeat of the Ottoman Empire at the hands of the British, French, and Russians, giving them control of the Middle East. They divided it up, and the British were given a mandate over Palestine. With the more sympathetic British now in control, these Jewish Zionists, as they were called, seized the opportunity to accelerate their plan for statehood. But creating a state for the Jews wasn't really the goal of the British, who just wanted to create a government in Palestine where power could be shared peacefully by the different groups living there. And then there were the Arabs, who didn't trust the British or the Jews because many of the Arab leaders thought the British would favor the Jews. So the Arabs refused to form any government that included Jewish participation. But before long, this stubbornness grew into frustration at not being represented, so some within the Arab community turned to violence and carried out bombing attacks against Jewish settlers and started to destroy the crops the settlers were growing on their farms. About a decade later, World War II broke out, and millions of Jews were killed by the Nazis in the Holocaust. After the American, British, and Allied forces defeated the Germans, hundreds of thousands of Jews came to Palestine, and the UN General Assembly passed a fateful plan to divide up Palestine into independent Arab and Jewish states, with the all-important city of Jerusalem placed under international control. But the 5 members of the Arab League didn't want the Jews to control any part of the land, so they all voted against the plan. In May 1948, after much planning and covert arms acquisition, the Jewish leadership went ahead and declared the establishment of the State of Israel, and quickly convinced the US government, the Soviet Union, and many other countries to officially recognize it. As expected by the Israelis, the Arab countries invaded Palestine immediately, but the Israelis were ready and were more disciplined, better trained, and well armed, and were too strong for their Arab enemies. When the dust settled, after 10 months of fighting and peace agreements were signed, Israel not only kept the whole area under the original UN plan, it controlled almost 60% of the land that had been planned for the Arab state. More than 700,000 Palestinian Arabs had also fled the fighting or were kicked out of their homes, and about the same amount of Jews migrated into Israel from Arab lands. So you had about 1.5 million people basically switching places, making the population of Israel much more Jewish. A generation later, in 1967, tensions were again reaching a boiling point. There had been some deadly cross-border attacks from both the Israelis and the Arabs, so Israel decided to launch a surprise invasion, and in 6 days won control of the Gaza Strip and Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, took the West Bank and East Jerusalem away from Jordan, and kicked Syria out of the Golan Heights. Fewer than 1,000 Israeli troops were killed in the short war, but over 20,000 Arab soldiers died, went missing, or were captured. And just like in the 1948 war, hundreds of thousands more Palestinian Arabs left. Since then, Israel's really built up its security capabilities and constructed many settlements in these newly occupied territories, even though the UN and the International Court of Justice declared the settlements illegal under international law. 10 years after the war, Israel returned the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt, and in 2005 pulled its troops and the settlers out of the Gaza Strip. But there are around 750,000 Jewish settlers in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. In 1993, Israel struck a deal with the leader of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, Yasser Arafat, and agreed to allow the Palestinians to set up a government and rule themselves in the Gaza Strip and the city of Jericho in the West Bank. In exchange, the PLO recognized the right of Israel to exist. This new Palestinian government, headed by Arafat, became known as the Palestinian Authority and was controlled by its majority party, Fatah. But not all Palestinians, especially people in the Gaza Strip, liked Arafat's more moderate approach, and so a split took place, leading to the rise of the more extremist Islamic party, Hamas, whose leaders refused to negotiate with Israel or recognize its right to exist. In 2006, Hamas won the Palestinian parliamentary election, but Fatah refused to be a minority party, and a violent power struggle between Hamas and Fatah played out in the streets of Gaza. After more than 100 people died in the fighting, Hamas controlled the area. So Arafat's successor, Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas, essentially cut the Gaza Strip loose from the Palestinian Authority and set up an emergency, Fatah-controlled government in the West Bank. So today, there are two fairly different Palestines. One is the West Bank, led by Abbas and his Fatah party, who more or less coexist peacefully with their many Jewish neighbors, although Israel is in the process of building a 400-mile-long barrier along the border. It's Abbas who's engaged in ongoing negotiations with Israel and the international community about reaching a solution to the conflict that would allow Palestine to become an independent country. The other Palestine is the Gaza Strip, which is essentially poor and mostly cut off from the rest of the world by Israel's sea embargo and a wall that divides it from Israel and Egypt, leaving its people without many basic necessities, including clean drinking water. Gaza is very dependent on the UN and the rest of the international community for aid. It's controlled by Hamas. Khaled Mashal is the chairman of Hamas and has led the party since the 2004 assassination of the Hamas leader al-Rantisi. Mashal, though, lives in Qatar. In 1997, Israel tried, but failed, to assassinate him in retaliation for the bombing of a market in Jerusalem that Hamas claimed responsibility for. It's Hamas who has been the target of repeated Israeli military actions recently, including this year's Operation Protective Edge, which was a response to a number of attacks by Hamas against Israelis, including kidnappings and rocket attacks, both of which have been aided by the digging of many tunnels under both the Gaza-Israeli border and Gaza's southern border with Egypt. Hamas uses these tunnels to smuggle in weapons and money that it gets from others in the region who have an interest in destabilizing Israel's security, like Iran. In its response to Hamas, Israel has taken heavy criticism for its destructive and vengeful airstrikes that kill a high number of civilians.
All the ancient pathways cross through Israel. Every empire throughout the last 2,000 years tried to settle the land of Israel. Babylonia, the Persians, the Medes, the Greeks, the Romans, the Ottomans, the British, all of these empires with all of their wealth and all of their resources tried, and all of them failed.
There are generally two ideas for how to end the conflict and give Palestinians statehood. The first is a two-state solution, where Israel and Palestine would be two sovereign countries living side by side. This is the strategy embraced by many in the international community, including US President Barack Obama, and is embraced by people like Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his Likud party. But time after time, negotiations around this solution fail because of the many issues it has to confront and resolve, like what to do about the 750,000 Jewish settlers in Palestinian areas, the instability of the Gaza Strip, the fact that the Gaza Strip and the West Bank aren't even connected, and of course, who would control Jerusalem? These obstacles have given rise to a second alternative solution that's embraced by many Arab Israelis and even Jewish politicians like the newly elected president of Israel, Reuven Rivlin. They think the only practical way to go is a one-state solution compromise, where neither the Palestinians nor the Jewish people get exactly what they want, but would instead be unified in one single state that would ensure equal rights for all of its citizens. Proponents of this plan think it would solve one of the world's toughest problems and remove the entire area from the criticism of the modern world. The main argument from Israelis against the one-state solution is that it would instantly end the idea of a Jewish state and would make Jews a minority again. But looking at the numbers on a combined Arab-Israeli state, Jews would number 6.6 million and Arabs around 5.6 million. Of course, that's before the issue of people migrating back to this unified country is settled. Another issue that would require a creative solution is the wealth gap between the technologically driven and very prosperous economy of Israel and the much more challenged economic situation of the Palestinian territories.
The first promise to Israel was made to Abraham, an eternal covenant. And I shall establish a covenant between me and you, and between your offspring after you throughout their generations, as an everlasting covenant. The Jewish people are the only ancient people alive today. The Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Jebusites, the Canaanites, all of them are gone.
Well, no nation has survived such scattering and then remained a nation. They became assimilated, and eventually any trace of the original is gone.
We, an eternal people, stand alive today. We also know that if the Jewish people don't live a godly life in the land of Israel, we're promised to be scattered to four corners of the earth.
Which is, guaranteed to cause an extinction of any people. Scatter people around the world, they're going to be gone.
The last thing you would want to do to an eternal people is to scatter them across the world with no common culture, no common language, no internet, no forms of communication. How will the Jewish people stay Jewish? How will we stay eternal if we're scattered across the world? And yet, that's exactly what happened.
We remain the people, not only just a faith or religion, but a family.
God will scatter you among the peoples, and you will be left few in number. The most recent census numbers the Chinese people at 1.3 billion, plus or minus 12 million. 12 million, that's the entire number of all of the Jewish people worldwide. We're a statistical error when just counting the people in China. That's how small we are.
The fact that we're scattered and small and we've been subject to the greatest hatred in human history.
The Torah tells us the atrocities and the curses that would come upon the Jewish people throughout the exile. And you I will scatter among the nations. I will unsheathe the sword after you.
No one has suffered as we have suffered. No one has been as persecuted.
Anti-Semitism, the oldest, most universal, intense, irrational hatred in the world.
If it was pogroms, crusades, the Inquisition, Muslim oppression, nation after nation, religion after religion,
and the persecution we faced has always transcended all logic and rational thought. When we were poor and destitute in the shtetl, we were hated for being parasites. When wealthy, for being money grubbing. One thing that we could always rely on is that there would always be a reason, a pretext to hate us.
And despite all the persecution, not only have we survived, but we've thrived.
Individuals from other faiths, such as Islam, are sometimes just as hostile, if not more so.
After the Iraq War, the USA and other countries have been keeping a control on the warring factions in the Middle East. With their withdrawal, these warring factions have been released. I became very aware of this with the recent invasion of Iraq by the terrorist group of the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS. It is interesting to note that they have taken the name of Isis, an Egyptian goddess which has the physical form of an angel. Now this is where it is important to understand that Scripture says we're released to kill a third of men and not a third of mankind. This is a region where they war against each other and not the rest of the world. It is a war between different religions in these countries where ISIS terrorists have a jihad to kill Shiite Muslims. The third of men is a third of the men of the region that is being spoken of in this scripture: Syria, Turkey, Iran and Iraq. Now the number of the army of the horsemen was 200 million. I heard the number of them. Islam plans to conquer countries in the world by populating it. A typical Muslim army is its population. In these countries, about 97% are Muslim. This Islamic army is 200 million. And thus I saw the horses in the vision. Those who sat on them had breastplates of fiery red, hyacinth blue, and sulphur yellow. And the heads of the horses were like the heads of lions, and out of their mouths came fire, smoke, and brimstone. The mode of transportation for these people is motor vehicles, which is horsepower. Note the breastplates of fiery red, hyacinth blue, and sulphur yellow. By these three plagues, a third of men were killed by the fire and the smoke and the brimstone, which came out of their mouths. Their aim is to kill 1/3 of men. The three plagues will probably be three types of weapon. Fire will be burning from incendiary weapons, smoke will be chemical weapons, and brimstone will be explosive weapons. For their power is in their mouth and in their tails, for their tails are like serpents, having heads, and with them they do harm. In these countries, all types of vehicles are used in war to fire guns and rockets. But the rest of men who were not killed by these plagues did not repent of the works of their hands, that they should not worship demons and idols of gold, silver, brass, stone and wood, which can neither see, nor hear, nor walk. And they did not repent of their murders, or their sorceries, or their sexual immorality, or their thefts. As this is not a region of idols of gold, silver, brass and stone and wood, it is clearly the attitude of the rest of the world who have left this country to sort themselves out without intervention, except to supply them weapons. This is like Obama's statement. The US will do our part, but it is up to the Iraqis, as a sovereign nation, to solve their problem.
I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee, and in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. Genesis 12:3. In one press conference after another, when referring to the Muslim terror supergroup ISIS, United States President Barack Obama will use the term ISIL instead of their former name ISIS, or current name Islamic State. Have you ever wondered about that? We have. ISIL stands for the Islamic State of Iraq and Levant. Now, to us Westerners, we don't really make much of a distinction, do we? No, honestly, from our perspective, it's all about the same. But how would a Muslim living in the Middle East view it? Just what is the Levant anyway? Let's take a look. The geographical term Levant refers to a multi-nation region in the Middle East. It's a land bridge between Turkey to the north and Egypt to the south. If you look on a map, however, in the near exact middle of the nations that comprise the Levant, guess what you see? Come on, guess. It's Israel. When Barack Obama refers over and over to the Islamic State as ISIL, he is sending a message to Muslims all over the Middle East that he personally does not recognize Israel as a sovereign nation, but as territory belonging to the Islamic State.
We will convey our deep appreciation for the Islamic faith, which has done so much over the centuries to shape the world.
I looked and I heard an eagle flying through the midst of heaven, saying with a loud voice, Woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth, because of the remaining blast of the trumpet of the three angels who are about to sound. After the 9/11 attack, George W. Bush spoke to many about the impending danger of Iraq, Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups. As the eagle is the symbol of the United States, this event is quite symbolic of the eagle saying, Woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth. I heard a voice voice from the four horns of the golden altar which is before God, saying to the sixth angel who had the trumpet, "Release the four angels who are bound at the great river Euphrates." The four countries on the Euphrates River system are Turkey, Syria, Iran, and Iraq. So the four angels who had been prepared for the hour and day and month and year were released to kill a third of men. Elsewhere in the New Testament, the Greek word anthropos is translated men and not mankind. Men is the correct translation, which changes the meaning of the scriptures.
The adherents of these and other faiths justify their animosity by believing they are told to defend the faith, but as armchair or even educated apologists or defenders of the faith, in light of the truth, they are simply argumentative, mean, and pretty noisy because they have gained their knowledge through a doctrinal system, and as a result display characteristics that don't attract anyone to their respective faiths.
There's a wonderful example just very recently in Homs, which was known as the crucible of the uprising, where you've seen that a truce was negotiated and Al-Qaeda-affiliated rebels have left the city, and peace is back in Homs. You know, cafes have opened up, restaurants have opened up, people are returning once again to Homs. So there is a template for a negotiated truce.
That's a very good point here. Michael, if I can go to you, let's talk about that truce that we just heard about from Kapil.
Washington has a problem, and that is trying to placate a number of political entities, including Turkey. Turkey is a real problem at this point, and Turkey is taking advantage of that and using whatever leeway that Washington gives to do its own thing in not only Syria but also in Iraq now, and it's upsetting the apple cart, and I think that's also upsetting Vladimir Putin as a consequence, not only of the shoot-down, but also the extent to which Turkey is trying to impose itself in that region. I've always looked upon Turkey as using ISIS for its own gains.
Of course. Patrick, it seems to me Washington is more concerned in putting roadblocks in front of Russia in its endeavors, invited endeavors, as I always have to mention here for our viewers, invited to Syria to protect the borders and to fight terrorists here. But Washington just wants to make sure that Russia doesn't succeed, because Washington's policy has nothing to do with fighting terrorism. As a matter of fact, if we go far enough back in time, ISIS and all these other groups are basically the outcome of failed American policies in the Middle East. We can't go that far back right now, but the issue is here, Washington doesn't want to see anyone succeed in this conflict, particularly Assad and the Russians.
Speaking as an American, the Paris attacks and then the downing of the Russian jet brought home some very bitter truths about American motivations there, to say nothing of Turkey's. We are now faced with American strategy that is very, very hard to take.
Islam is not part of the problem in combating violent extremism. It is an important part of promoting peace. The enduring faith of over 1 billion people is so much bigger than the narrow hatred of a few. It is important for Western countries to avoid impeding Muslim citizens from practicing religion as they see fit. And I consider it part of my responsibility as President of the United States to fight against negative stereotypes of Islam wherever they appear.
Let it all fade away. Let your worries fade away. Fade away. Let your troubles drain away. Drain away. Let your troubles drain away. Away. 'Cause today is a brand new. Today